You think you know death. You think a grave is just a hole, a place where the body ends, where the story stops, where the cold earth closes over flesh, and that is that. Practical, final, forgettable. But somewhere out there, beneath 30,000 years of frozen Russian soil, two children are lying head to head, draped in 10,000 beads of mammoth ivory, clutching spears longer than the men who carried them. Nobody needed to do that. Survival did not demand it. And yet someone, with hands raw from the cold, spent thousands of hours threading those beads one by one for the dead. The strangest thing your ancestors ever did was not how they lived. It was how they buried. Most of us imagine prehistory as a brutal scramble. Eat, breed, survive, die. We picture grunting figures hunched against the ice, too busy staying alive to think about meaning. But the graves tell a different story. The graves are where the human mind first leaves a fingerprint on eternity. They are the oldest evidence we have that someone, somewhere, stood over a body and refused to believe it was simply gone. And the stranger the grave, the louder that refusal echoes across the millennia. These are not just curiosities. They are the first questions we ever asked about ourselves. Why are we here? Where do we go? What is a person when the breathing stops? Let us go to the evidence, because the evidence is almost unbelievable. Begin in Russia, at a site called Sungir, excavated through the 1950s and 60s. Here, anthropologist Eric Trinkhaus and his colleagues studied burials roughly 34,000 years old. An older man and the two children were interred with a staggering quantity of grave goods. Across all the burials, archaeologists counted more than 13,000 individual beads carved from mammoth ivory. Researchers have estimated that a single bead took around an hour to produce. Do the arithmetic, and you are looking at years of human labor devoted entirely to honoring the dead. The children also lay beside spears made from mammoth tusks that had somehow been straightened, a technique we still do not fully understand. This was not a quick goodbye. This was an enormous, society-wide investment in someone who could no longer hunt, gather, or contribute anything at all. Now travel south to a cave in the mountains of northern Iraq called Shanidar. There, in the 1950s, archaeologist Ralph Selecki uncovered the remains of several Neanderthals. Around one of them, known as Shanidar 4, his collaborator, the palynologist Arlette Leroy-Gourhan, found dense clusters of ancient pollen from yarrow, cornflower, and other flowering plants. Selecki proposed something that shook the scientific world, that Neanderthals, our supposedly brutish cousins, had laid their dead to rest on a bed of flowers. The claim is fiercely debated. Some researchers argue burrowing rodents carried the pollen in, but more recent excavations at Shanidar continue to find Neanderthals deliberately placed in the same spot over generations, suggesting this cave was, in some sense, a chosen place for the dead, a place they returned to, a place that mattered. And then there is perhaps the strangest grave of all, in a cave called Hilazon Taktit in Israel, dated to around 12,000 years ago. The archaeologist Leori Grossman excavated the burial of an elderly woman from the Natufian culture, and what surrounded her defies easy explanation. She was buried with 50 complete tortoise shells, with the wing of a golden eagle, with the pelvis of a leopard, the forearm of a wild boar, and the tip of a human foot that did not belong to her. Her body had been carefully wedged in place with 10 large stones. Grossman and her colleagues concluded that this woman was almost certainly a shaman, one of the earliest such figures we can identify in the archaeological record. Someone whose role was not to hunt or to gather, but to speak to the unseen. Imagine being there. The wind comes down off the highlands, cold and dry, carrying the smell of dust and crushed thyme. Below you, the cave mouth glows orange. Inside, the fire snaps and throws long shadows that climb the limestone walls and bend across the faces of everyone gathered. There are perhaps a dozen of you, pressed shoulder to shoulder, your breath fogging in the chill. The old woman lies in a pit dug into the cave floor. You have known her your whole life. When the sickness came, she sang over you. When the child would not be born, she was there in the dark, her hands steady. Now she is still, and the world feels thinner without her. One by one, the offerings are placed. The tortoise shells, gathered over weeks, 50 of them, each one a journey, each one a meal, eaten in her honor. The great wing of the eagle, its feathers catching the firelight, laid beside her like a promise of flight. You watch as the heavy stones are set down to hold her in place, and you do not ask why, because everyone knows why. You do not want her to leave. You do not want her to wander. You want to keep her somehow, even now. The fire crackles. Someone begins to sing the low song, the one she taught you, and the sound fills the cave and presses against the stone, and for one breathless moment, it feels as if the dark itself is listening. This is the twist, and it is a profound one, because when you look closely at these graves, you realize that the weirdness is the whole point. None of it was necessary. None of it helped anyone eat or stay warm or fend off a predator. The beads, the flowers, the eagle wings, the tortoise shells, the straightened tusks. Every one of these objects is a luxury, an extravagance, a deliberate waste of precious time and energy in a world that punished waste with death. And that is exactly why they are the most important things your ancestors ever made. Because the moment a human being spends a year carving beads for a corpse, something extraordinary has happened inside the skull. That human has begun to live in time. They can imagine a past and a future. They can hold the idea of a person who no longer exists and decide that this absent person still has worth, still deserves love, still belongs. They have invented the soul, or at least the ache that makes us reach for one. The strange grave is the birthplace of religion, of art, of memory, of grief itself. It is the moment our species stopped merely surviving and started meaning. And consider what that meaning cost. To bury your dead with ceremony, you need a society wealthy enough to spare the labor. You need shared belief, passed down in stories. You need someone, like the woman of Hilazon Taktit, whose entire purpose is to tend the boundary between the living and the dead. The strange grave did not just reflect a complex society. It helped build one. It bound people together with invisible threads of obligation and faith. It gave them a reason to cooperate that went far beyond the next meal. In a very real sense, the things we found in these graves are the foundations of civilization, laid not in stone, but in sorrow. There is one more grave worth standing beside before we go. In a cave in Wales in the year 1823, the geologist William Buckland uncovered a skeleton stained deep red with ochre, buried with ivory rods and seashell jewelry. He called it the Red Lady of Paviland and assumed it was a woman from Roman times. He was wrong on both counts. The skeleton was a young man, and he was around 33,000 years old, one of the oldest ceremonial burials ever found in Western Europe. Someone covered his body in red pigment, the color of blood, the color of life, as if to pull vitality back into the lifeless flesh. Across continents and tens of thousands of years, again and again, your ancestors reached for the dead and refused to let them simply vanish into the dark. So think again about that hole in the cold ground. It is not an ending. It never was. It is the first sentence of the longest story our species has ever told. The story we are still telling at every funeral, every gravestone, every name spoken aloud after the person is gone. 34,000 years ago, someone sat in the freezing dark and threaded a bead onto a string, and then another, for a child who would never wear them in life. They could not have known that you would one day stand over their work and feel your chest tighten with a grief that needs no translation. But they were speaking to you. Across all that ice and time, they were saying the same thing. We still cannot stop saying, "You mattered. You mattered. Please let me keep you a little longer. You think you know death, but your ancestors knew something stranger, something braver. They knew that the body ends, and they buried it anyway with flowers and feathers and 10,000 beads, as if to argue with the silence itself. And in that beautiful, impossible argument, in that refusal to let go, they did not just bury their dead. They invented the part of us that remembers.